It is a Wednesday. That means it's time for a little free therapy when every week we check in with Dr. Laura Saunders. She's a child psychologist at the Institute of Living.
Thanks so much for joining us, Dr. Saunders. How are you?
I am well. It's nice to see you both here today.
Nice to see you. So October is ADHD Awareness Month. So this is something that affects a lot of families, right?
Yeah, I was looking. The CDC says now we have about 6 million kids diagnosed in the U.S.
Yes. So ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and know that it can be with or without the hyperactivity component. Often it takes a little longer to diagnose without the hyperactivity component. It is really the most common neurodevelopmental disorder of childhood. It's generally diagnosed in childhood, but more and more adults are getting diagnosed. But even if you get diagnosed in adulthood, you generally have to trace it back to your childhood. So it's not just a disorder that comes on in adulthood. And so there's some core symptoms that we can talk about as a way that are hallmarks of ADHD.
Right. I mean, so many parents I know have been diagnosed only because they finally got their kids diagnosed and then realized that was my problems too. So let's talk about that. What is the road to the assessment? Like, what do we do to get a diagnosis?
So there's several different things that you can do to get a diagnosis. You can get an examination by a pediatrician. Many pediatricians, or most pediatricians, are capable of assessing ADHD by a psychologist or psychiatrist, because the important thing is actually to rule out other possible causes. Anxiety can cause attentional issues, so you want to rule out medical causes. It's usually a series of interviews, and it could be some what we call self-report measures given to parents, teachers, and other caregivers.
So you were talking about some of those core symptoms too. What should parents or caretakers, even teachers, look out for?
What we're looking for is inattention, impulsivity, easily distracted, motoric restlessness. So those are some of the kind of core symptoms. And then there are criteria for each of those symptoms. But inattention, impulsivity, easily distracted, and motoric restlessness are some of the core, most common symptoms.
So if a parent is listening right now, I think step one, you're saying it can often start with a physical examination from the pediatrician. Then there are some forms and even like self-report tests. Which ones would you recommend just for the quality aspect? Because I know there's so much online. Like what would a parent want to do just to see?
Yeah, I mean, the Conners is probably one of the most common ones, but there's several out there. And I always like to highlight that we're not talking about just active children, right? Because often parents say, oh, you're just ruling out the fact that, kids are active in childhood. Yes, kids should be active in childhood, but what we're talking about is a level of inattention, impulsivity, and activity that goes beyond developmental norms.
Well, I'm glad that you're making that distinction, because I think there are so many parents who can't really make that distinction or differentiate, and that's why there's so much maybe confusion around getting a diagnosis, because kids have a lot of energy and kids like to run around and expend some of that. So when does it become a problem? Is it when they can't sit down and focus on their schoolwork, or have trouble sleeping, or is there a whole range of those kinds of things that we should be concerned about?
It's actually all of those things, Caitlin. And when it hinders their functioning, right? A 3, 4, 5-year-old, they're going to be active. They're in various settings, either they're at home or they're in, preschool or child daycare settings. And it may become obvious that this one particular child has a level of activity, impulsivity, and inattention that is beyond their peers. It becomes more problematic in school when they don't have the ability to sit, pay attention, take in information. Organization is a later skill that becomes apparent that there's a deficit, but it encompasses several of those things.
So, I mean, there are a lot of, great things I know that we're not going to talk about right now. We will in the Kara's Cures podcast. There can also be, some good things like a lot of energy and creativity and all this. But I want to just really quick in our last minute talk about girls, because often girls are diagnosed later. Sometimes they're forgotten. And that may be because we're not seeing the hyperactivity. But what could it look like in girls, and why are we seeing more diagnosis about the 8th grade high school time?
Because you're right, Kara, the girls have less of the hyperactivity component, and so more of just the attention deficit disorder. And one of the core symptoms without the hyperactivity component is organizational problems. And we don't really tap into a lot of organizational needs until you get into middle school and high school. So that's when a lack of executive functioning or organizational issues becomes very apparent, is when you're going to multiple classes per day. So you have multiple books, and you have to have your organization of assignments and homework and things from multiple classes, and they have more long-term assignments. So it's not just you do something, you do the homework, you bring it in the next day. It's this project is due in 3 weeks, and there's 10 steps to it. So those organizational issues really become more apparent in middle school and high school, and that's when we see those kids who don't have the hyperactivity component but have the attentional issues and the disorganization.
Dr. Saunders, so much information. I know we're going to do this as a 2-part series, both the diagnosis and then some of the treatments, so stay tuned for that. We're also going to have a lot more coming up on the Kara's Cures podcast. You can watch it and download it on WFSB on our app or on Apple or Spotify. So we'll see you in a little bit. Thank you so much.
Thank you.